Hi there, in today's video we'll be understanding setting. The setting of a narrative are the places and times in which the action is located. Settings help to bring the world of a narrative to life in our imagination. Characters become all the more vivid and real to us as we visualize the surrounding in which their experiences unfold. Long narratives, such as novels and films, have more than one setting. Different characters can live in different places and/or times. Main characters can move from one setting to another in response to their changing circumstances. A great example of this is George Orwell's 1984, which is set in London, 40 years after World War II, is in a fictional city which isn't identified as London but as Airstrip 1, which is the capital of the fictional Oceania Empire, and Winston, the main character, moves between his apartment, his workplace at the Ministry of Truth, his rented apartment, and the Ministry of Love, where he is rehabilitated. It's easy to think of setting within a story as the time, so we need to think about the time period, but also the date and the time of day, and the place and environment, the physical landscape structure and weather and seasons which the author or filmmaker uses to present a point of view or potentially explore a theme. Why we need to look for examples of setting as we analyze any text is because settings can contribute to our understanding of a text and the ideas and issues explored. The setting may be nothing more than the backdrop for what occurs, however, it may have another meaning or represent a larger idea that the author wants us, the reader or viewer, to understand. An initial question to ask when analyzing a setting throughout any text is, what features of the setting are presented and how are they presented? Typically, within a written text, these are the descriptions that rely upon nouns, adjectives, and verbs, and even the use of figurative language. For instance, outside the night was cold and wet, but in the small living room the curtains were closed and the fire burned brightly. Within a visual text, we tend to rely upon cinematography, the camera shot, angle, frame, lighting, and everything else involved within its mise en scène. Additional questions that we need to ask as we go to analyze a setting and consider what features it uses are: do the environments embody features of society that the author may wish to emphasize, such as within the time and place? Are natural environments described as having a positive or negative quality to the main character and their surrounding? How is this related to interactions between the people and the natural world? And more importantly, how do characters' responses to setting reflect their feeling? For example, do they feel comfortable and settled? Or, alternatively, are they restless, fearful, or even seeking change in their lives? We might ask, why do we need to analyze setting? And as already covered, settings are important because they are a macro, so in the larger scope, but also micro, small environment in which the characters live. In some instances, authors might expand upon this, which we'll explore shortly. They can be sites of challenge and/or struggle, which help create the narrative structure of the conflict, or even reward characters and can be set in real or imagined worlds. They can draw upon contemporary, so current situations and circumstances, or draw upon historical periods, or even geographical locations or potential aspects of culture that are present in the past or today. We are now going to read an excerpt from J.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped like hallway, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with panelled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on and on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then another. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighbourhood of the hill for a time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they had never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. Now, if we consider the opening of "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," we can actually contextualize that Tolkien was a language scholar and he was partially motivated to write his stories by the desire to invent other languages. Here he implies at the beginning of chapter 1 that this fantasy world, which he later dubbed Middle-earth and expanded upon, is somehow connected to our own world, saying that the hobbits have become rare and shy of big people, or humans, which is why we no longer see them around. If we consider the following description of "not a nasty dirty wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry bare sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort," with a stress on comfort. We have a nice little comparison and some nice adjectives being used. It was the primarily wealthy families of hobbits that built smears, spacious and luxurious tunnels, a souped-up version of a hobbit hole, and clearly we can see that Bag End, the home of Bilbo Baggins, is this very smear. As it was expansive hobbit hole, which is described in great detail, we can tell through the large circular green front door and number of rooms that he had quite a bit of room and wealth behind him, which he would hold many parties. If we consider this description even further, we can see that it was a very comfortable tunnel with smoke, with panelled walls and floors and tiled and carpeted. So there's a great bit of detail and description here from J.R. Tolkien, which creates a relaxing mood. As through the descriptions of the detail, we can understand that Bilbo Baggins is quite comfortable and it has class. We can then understand, and this is from many critics of Tolkien, that he wanted Middle-earth to point to the Shire as a classless society where all were equal, but some not so much than others, where we had the range of farmers. We had Baggins actually being quite rich, and this is because Tolkien based the Shire on real English countryside, where such families were essential to the rural community, where everyone served a purpose but had a particular trade or job that they had to continue. Okay. If we look further and expand upon this setting, we can see that Middle-earth was so much more than just a mythological, fantastic realm. Its larger purpose and contextually was to draw upon Greek and Roman mythologies. In fact, Tolkien first wrote about Middle-earth with the intention of creating an entirely new mythology for English people, and the story form is based on ancient heroics that Tolkien admired when he studied at Oxford. But essentially we can see that the setting is very important to the story of Bilbo Baggins being pushed out of the Shire, somewhere that was safe and comfortable, to going on a great adventure throughout the novel and then expanding upon it in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Once again, why do we need to analyze setting? Well, we need to understand how places and societies are represented, whether positively or negatively, and what the author wants us to understand as we explore them as the reader. It is always important to consider how a setting is represented or may be used to also suggest a theme or idea. When we go to write about setting, it's not simply about describing those locations, but to show your understanding as the reader of how those settings influence you as a reader to think or feel and understand other elements of the text. One great idea is to focus on how the setting might contrast or change throughout the novel and impact the character. We might take a quick look at some film examples, although I won't be doing this in all the videos. Here's a nice little example from District 9 by Neil Blomkamp. Okay, here in the top left-hand corner we see the film advertisement. To the far right, top right, we see the slum which District 9 exists in. We have Wickus down below, and already in that medium shot or establishing shot of him standing with an alien gun, we can see that District 9 isn't looking so great with the broken walls, the minimal lush green environment, and we can see that Wickus very much looks out of his element. And to the bottom right, we have the alien ship hovering over District 9 with the barbed wire fence, helicopter, and patrol. Now, this is all actually based on both fiction but also fact, as the title and premise of District 9 were inspired by the events in Cape Town's District 6 during the apartheid era, specifically in inner city residential area in Cape Town, where it was declared that whites only were allowed to be in that section in 1966, with 60,000 people forcibly removed to Cape Flats. So if you weren't white, you were removed out of this area and put into a slum, which is very much like a detention center. And coming from Neil Blomkamp himself, a direct quote, he wrote, "So the whole film grew out of a love-hate relationship with Johannesburg, really, and then once I put the science fiction in there, which happened to be aliens arriving to Earth, which is a totally cliched normal piece of sci-fi fiction, so he's drawing upon genre that's been around for 100 years. All of these other much more serious topics that I was aware of consciously and subconsciously started to work their way into the film. So all the segregation and racism, which is a key theme explored within District 9 and everything else, kind of became evident because you can't get around that if you are set there in the film. So if we look at this and we think about those themes of segregation, which means division or forced division, and, well, racism, we can consider the following. We see that the picture or the film overhead shot which shows the slum in which the aliens are forced to live is very similar to the historical Cape Area 6, which people were actually forced to live in. We then have the focusing shots from 1966 showing the same design and separation. We then also see people very much like Vickers surrounded by slums, not to such an extent, but it's further explored in the film. We then have signs such as the Division Council of the Cape, which suggested or enforced that this was a white area and blacks were not allowed. We then see this appear in the fictional District 9 with the same slum setting, but signs showing non-human loitering, where you're not allowed to be unless you're an alien, so showing that division. We then have the settings of the beat-up, somewhat urban graffitied houses in which people still live in terms of slums in South Africa today, up until the late 90s and 2000s, which is replicated by the aliens, or the slang derogatory term called as prawns, are forced to live. We then have them also having to wait in line for food and supplies, as would have happened in the historical Cape Town 6. And in summary, overall, what we want to think about when we look at a setting, regardless of the text type, whether it be a film or novel or short story, is what are the key descriptions or cinematic techniques that draw the reader's attention to the setting and why? So we want to look for key descriptions that use nouns and adjectives and figurative language, or use visual mediums such as mise-en-scène. What do the descriptions or cinematic techniques help to convey or suggest about the time period in which they are set? How do the settings influence the characters' decisions and actions? And how does the historical setting shape the effect of the characters in these texts? So when is the time and place reflective of what the author wants us to think and feel? But most importantly, what kind of society and culture is depicted in each text? So does the social context restrict or enhance characters' opportunities? Are there characters that are threatened by the society in which they live? That's all we're going to focus on for today, but just be mindful that you should always be looking for examples of setting, and as always, thanks for watching.